made it possible for Castro to rid himself of the very class that had done so much to help him during the hard fight against Batista, and which had suffered the greatest number of casualties at the hands of Batista's torturers, and now was outraged that Castro was bent on denying it the privileges that it had long enjoyed. To their astonishment, he refused to return to business as usual. The middle class's contribution to defeating Batista was largely written out of the official story of the revolution's triumph, and soon the exiles would form a base where, with the constant encouragement and support of successive American administrations, they would launch 1,000 conspiracies and plots to subvert Castro and his regime. Fidel would thwart more than 500 assassination attempts over the long decades of his rule. 1 out of 6 Cubans fled to the United States. Geography is fate. It was both Fidel's curse as well as his blessing that the United States was so near. He was able to banish his opposition and send it packing across the Florida Straits. Having the United States provide a haven for his opposition meant that he could favor expulsion over extermination. This was particularly true after the missile crisis of October 1962, which ended in a secret understanding between the United States and the Soviet Union. In exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet nuclear missiles, Washington agreed to end its violent efforts to overthrow Fidel and his regime. Now, of course, this was a shift in policy honored more in the breach than in the practice. It did nothing to weaken the economic embargo that Washington had imposed on Cuba and which remains in force to the present day. But the revolution had secured a degree of security. Castro, with the indispensable subvention of the Soviet Union, began to enforce an ethic of self-denial and unremitting labor. But the disobliging truth is that despite unrelenting effort, neither incessant moral hectoring nor harsh laws against absenteeism, laws that came into force shortly after Tony and I were working in the cane fields in 1970, despite the many years of being enjoined to be like Che, Cubans, by and large, remained firmly attached to the pleasure principle, with an undiminished affection for American movies, music, and sport, and goods. It didn't seem to matter whether they were workers or peasants, whether they toiled in the cities or labored in the countryside. The Russian Lada never had a chance against the American Ford. After years of wearing Arrow shirts, riding in Otis elevators, and repairing their clothes with Singer sewing machines, Cubans found it all but impossible to accept the inferior goods produced in the Soviet bloc. Ideology succumbed to aesthetics. And nor could the Cuban Revolution be exported, as Castro had hoped, even if its example proved to be of immense inspiration to aspiring, suffering peoples everywhere. Neither the debacle of Che's doomed effort in Bolivia to ignite a continental rebellion, nor in recent years the exemplary work of tens of thousands of doctors and teachers, Cuban doctors and teachers in a score of countries worked. The one commodity that Cuba had in abundance and could successfully export all over the world was music. Only music could travel unimpeded, and the music that sold best was the pre-revolutionary music of an older, nearly forgotten Cuba, whose representatives had become the invisible men and women of a decaying, melancholic Havana. As early as 1920, RCA Victor began advertising what one critic would later call the languorous appeal of native melodies. By 1925, hundreds of Cuban songs had been recorded and broadcast across America on the burgeoning commercial national radio network. The fusion of Spanish melody and African rhythm, the varied forms of Cuban music, son, danzón, guajira, rumba, mambo, proved spectacularly seductive. Its erotic appeal explicit. Miami, it is worth remembering, was deliberately created in the early 1920s as a faux Havana, developers going to extraordinary lengths to achieve verisimilitude, in one instance importing more than 2 million old clay barrel roof tiles from Havana to give Miami the kind of weathered patina only time can bestow. And it's perhaps a further irony that for all the efforts made to fashion a new music that would promote the revolution's political ideals, and in this, my old junior high school chum who went to then Garfield Junior High School, now called Martin Luther King School, Paul, now Pablo Menendez, the son of Barbara Dane, he would play a leading role as a charter member of the Nueva Trova movement, along with Silvio Rodriguez and Pablo Milanés. The music, despite their efforts, that triumphed all over the world was the pre-revolutionary music that antedated Fidel's arrival. The varied and traditional forms of Cuban music proved astonishingly seductive and enduring, largely impervious to the periodic attempts to annex them to the revolution's agenda. The best representatives of that music were, after 1959, shunted aside. They were the embodiment and a reminder of the irrepressible libido that resisted being enrolled in the service of the revolution. These musicians were often regarded for many years with suspicion by the revolution's cultural power brokers as untrustworthy custodians of fantasies of indulgence and abandon. And all of that was clear from Ry Cooder and Wim Wenders' rediscovery of the Buena Social Vista Club. What, after all, did these musicians have to do with the Fidelista upheaval? The truth is that the revolution notwithstanding, they and their art always had been a defining feature of Cuba's culture, a feature that proved tremendously influential all over the world. Today, for Cuba's millennials, that music is music for tourists. Even salsa seems to belong more to the past than to the present. What commands the ear of the young in Cuba today is something called reggaeton, which has swept the Latinx world. Rooted in a robotic beat, crafted from a relentless computer algorithm, reggaeton has conquered the international market, including Cuba. It's ubiquitous. It's an admixture of rap and the insistent beat of the boombox era. More of that than the lilting songs of work and longing that were the Guajiros' lament. The lyrics are often explicitly sexist, full of macho posturing, at pains to worship at the altar of consumerism. As Nancy Morejon, whose name was invoked by Tony at the start of this talk, who is one of Cuba's leading poets, now 75, and a past president of the writers section of the Union of Writers and Artists, said to me 4 weeks ago, "For this, we fought a revolution?" 20 years ago, in 1999, I attended, along with more than 2,000 other Americans, a sold-out concert of the Buena Vista Social Club, making their debut in Los Angeles at the Art Deco Wiltern Theater. With the legendary Cachato Lopez on bass, the elegant silver-haired Ruben Gonzalez at the piano, the silky Ibrahim Ferrer, and the sexy Omara Portuondo at the microphone, and a dozen other virtuoso musicians, including Eliados Ochoa, the entire ensemble seemed a miracle, indeed a resurrection. Effortlessly gliding from ballad to ballad, the trombonist suddenly broke into a languorous Cuban-inflected melody whose familiar strains were greeted with recognition and an audible gasp of that recognition from the delighted audience. He was playing lyrically and lovingly Somewhere Over the Rainbow. The audience began to sing, wistfully at first, and then with gathering conviction, the lyrics of one of America's best-known tunes. Whatever else might be said about Cuba and the United States, one thing was certain: it was not yet the end of the affair. Now, in Castro's sunset years, in an effort to resuscitate the ailing Cuban economy, hard hit after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Havana turned to tourism in a big way, especially as the international market for sugar continued to contract. But the island's revolutionary luster had dimmed. The market for tourists of the revolution had all but collapsed, and now, once again, Cuba sought to present itself as an exotic location for fantasies of indulgence and abandon, the very thing the revolution had been at pains to renounce. A new generation of Western movie stars, rock musicians, and supermodels, from Robert Redford to Ry Cooder to Naomi Campbell, parachuted into the island, seeking renewal and rejuvenation at the fount of its irrepressible libido. Havana, founded exactly 500 years ago this year, in 1519. You have to think, Old Havana, this is a Renaissance city, founded only a few years after the death of Leonardo da Vinci, once again became a magnet for outsiders after years of deliberate neglect. The magnificently restored antique buildings from the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, all jostling for space in a 350-acre section of Old Havana. A Cuban friend with whom I met recently, a friend of 50 years standing, a former Cuban ambassador, said to me last month, quote, "Thank God for the people who convinced Fidel that we should invest in the rehabilitation of our architectural heritage. Otherwise, these precious artifacts of our history would have collapsed and disappeared, bulldozed into oblivion." Credit largely goes to the indefatigable Eusebio Leal Spengler, the city's official historian. He was able to wield considerable clout as a member of Cuba's National Assembly, a member of the Communist Party's Central Committee, and the powerful Council of State. Fidel's decision to restore Old Havana required overcoming one of Castro's deepest prejudices that had long shaped the revolutionary priorities. In the past, Havana was regarded, not unreasonably, not wrongly, as a leech, sucking a disproportionate share of the country's scarce resources. Havana was the opulent playground of gangsters and politicians who were corrupt. It was home to an elite battening off the immiseration of campesinos who labored for centavos in the countryside. Fidel was determined to carry out a sweeping reversal. And so for decades, Havana, a city of 1 million in 1959, now a metropolis of 2 million, was intentionally neglected as a matter of state policy in favor of devoting more resources to the overwhelming majority of impoverished Cubans who lived outside the capital. The decision to abandon that policy, taken in the early 1980s, has paid off. Today, tourism accounts for an estimated 40% of all Cuba's foreign exchange earnings. To give you a sense of scale, Cuba's economy is just under 10% of the Netherlands, $90 billion as against the Dutch economy of $900 billion. The Netherlands, it's also important to keep in mind, has a population of 17 million people, just 6 million more than Cuba. But there is an irony. My friend, the former diplomat, is convinced that 100% of all foreigners visiting Havana come not to admire or examine the achievements of the revolution, but rather to wonder and marvel at the edifices, Morro Castle, for example, built by slave labor under colonial Spanish rule, now preserved by the revolution, that regards itself as the inheritor of the heroes of Cuban independence who fought to throw off the shackles of Spanish colonialism, and then later the corrupting constraints and suffocations of U.S. neocolonialism and its Cuban puppets. When the Soviet Union fell, Cuba was bereft. Fidel said, quote, "We lost all our markets for sugar. We stopped receiving foodstuffs, fuel, even the wood to bury our dead in. From one day to the next, we found ourselves without fuel, without raw materials, without food, without soap, without everything." The feverish attempts to diversify the economy had largely failed. Even today, Cuba is vulnerable. Trump's zombie foreign policy, despite Castro's demise and the end of the Cold War, and just a scant 36 months after the Obama opening, seeks to humiliate Cuba and to punish its leaders and people for the sin of refusing to bow to Washington's interests. 2 months ago, I learned when I was there, under pressure from Trump, Brazil's new leader cut off all exports of chickens to Cuba, an indispensable part of the Cuban diet and the source of the country's entire supply. Cubans I spoke to last month are stunned by the suddenness and pettiness, not to mention the criminality, of Trump's efforts to throttle the revolution. A revolution that the ghoulish John Bolton and Elliott Abrams are convinced, mistakenly, has sunk into senescence. The last several months have seen the withdrawal of diplomatic personnel from the U.S. Embassy, leaving just a skeletal janitorial staff and a Marine Guard, the expulsion of Cuban diplomats from their embassy in Washington, the curtailing of business travel, the cutoff of people-to-people large-scale tourism by eliminating a subcategory of approved travel, levying some of the largest blockade violation fines ever, the triggering of the clauses of the punitive Helms-Burton law permitting lawsuits against third-party investors in Cuba who seek to build on land claimed by long-ago owners, denying visas that had formerly been routinely granted to scholars, artists, writers, and musicians, putting Cuba on an international terrorist watch list, condemning it as a pariah state, enjoining international banks not to do business, successfully, as I learned from Sandy Levinson, the founder and director of the Center for Cuban Studies based in New York, successfully pressuring PayPal to withdraw its use by the Center for People, and ramping up PayPal. It's a, yeah. You can't buy something for that and use PayPal. PayPal says we're not going to process the exchange, and ramping up an increasingly bellicose rhetoric reminiscent of the darkest days of the Cold War. A hurricane of turbocharged capitalism swirls about this socialist island as the generation that fought the revolution passes from the scene, and the generation of kids who were 15 or 16 in 1959 and helped to create and extend the revolution by enrolling themselves in the great literacy campaign that fanned out across the country to teach peasants to read and write in the flush of the first fever decade and a half. They are themselves entering old age, and the future is passing into the hands of the generation that was born during the 1980s and 90s, the years of the so-called special period after the fall of the Soviet Union, a generation for whom the slogans of their grandfathers, whose achievement seemed almost superhuman, and who cast a very long shadow, carry less and less weight. There is a palpable contest now unfolding in Cuba for the hearts and minds of the millennials. My old friend, Miguel Barnett, a poet and ethnographer, the editor of the remarkable autobiography of a runaway slave, a copy of which I hope is on these shelves, and if not, I will donate one, and the outgoing two-term president of the Union of Writers and Artists, who will be 80 in January. He delivered a candid and sober speech at the end of June at the Union's 9th Congress. He worried aloud over what he called, quote, the impact of the global colonizing wave on Cuban society. He acknowledged that despite 6 decades of ceaseless effort, Cuba's government faces, quote, a daily battle against bureaucracy, corruption, routine, and he decried what he called, rather mysteriously, insensibility. He condemned attempts by Cuba's foreign enemies to create an intellectual fifth column, and he urged his fellow writers and artists to, quote, combat passivity, accommodation, and mediocrity, and he derided the persistence in Cuba, after 60 years, of, quote, vulgar materialism, marginal behavior, self-interest, discrimination, and intolerance. He was more succinct when I spoke with him on the eve of my departure. I asked him, what was the greatest cultural challenge facing Cuban society? He replied without a hint of irony, bad taste.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's for you.
It would, however, we have a lot of it here, but one would have thought the revolution would have provided a certain inoculation against its recreation there. At any rate, it would, in my view, be a grave mistake to underestimate the enduring appeal of the largest legacy of Fidel's triumph, standing up for the right of small states to resist the bullying domination of large powers, and to have conferred upon his people something as mysterious and elusive, but nonetheless real, as pride and dignity. Fidel was not willing to submit to the dictates of Washington, nor was he always a reliable cat's paw for Moscow. One has only to examine the roots of Castro's Africa policies, which antedated his coziness with the Soviet Union and was carried out independently of Soviet desires throughout much of the 1960s, despite what, in my judgment, is his inexplicable and appalling endorsement of the August 68 invasion of Czechoslovakia, and the overthrow of Alexander Dubček. Whatever else might be said of this most complicated and audacious figure, and the revolution he created in his own remarkable image, he strode the world stage as if his island were a continental power, raising a prophetic voice, decrying the unequal relations between North and South, upholding the right of rebellion and human solidarity, denouncing the despoilment of the environment, and excoriating what he called, quote, the profligate, egotistical, and insatiable consumerism of the developed countries. There is, of course, a largely unacknowledged irony. Had Fidel died shortly after overthrowing Batista, his unsullied place in Cuba's history would have been assured. His work as a revolutionary might have been regarded as fruitful up to the moment when he failed to recognize that it was time to step aside. He was unable to do so. In my judgment, his lust for power and a sense of messianic mission prevented him. Nations, it has been said, which do not have the opportunity to get rid of their geniuses are sometimes liable to pay dearly for them. Or as Bertolt Brecht put it more pithily, unhappy the nation that needs heroes. As for the United States, Washington's obstinate and forlorn refusal to award Cuba the relations it's willing to accord other communist countries like China and Vietnam is petulance raised to the level of policy. Cuba's heresy does not rest on the revolution's ideological conceits. Rather, it rests on its unwillingness to accept America's hemispheric hegemony. Cuba is neither the revolutionary specter of its most fervent supporters, nor the subversive hobgoblin of White House propagandists. Havana's continuing threat does not lie in its fealty to Marxist doctrine, but rather in the delusions suffered by planners in the Pentagon, and in its exemplary example of stiff-necked resistance to American hubris. For in the eyes of Washington's imperial overlords, yesterday and today, Cuba's greatest sin is its pride, and that they can never forgive. Over the course of my 50 years of visiting the island and thinking deeply about the relations between the United States and the Pearl of the Antilles, I've become more and more convinced that the story that best explains our intimate and complex entanglements is to consider it the story of a love affair gone bad. A love affair between two peoples thrown together by geography and history. Neither the United States nor Cuba has ever fully acknowledged how irrevocably they are lodged in the frontal lobe of each other's consciousness and imagination. Or to put it another way, understanding Cuba-U.S. relations may well be more a matter for a psychiatrist's couch than a political scientist's classroom. I, like many others, went to Cuba because I was inspired by the promise of the revolution and also by the internationalism and martyrdom of Che Guevara, whose murder at the hands of the CIA in Bolivia in October of 1967 I well remember and can never forgive or forget. I wanted to understand better and experience firsthand the remarkable social experiments that seemed to open a window on a better, more just future, especially for those in what was then called the Third World, who suffered the sharp end of the American stick. In the end, I fell in love with the Cuban people. And the question that has bedeviled me for the past 5 decades is simply this: to what extent is the character and culture of the Cuban people today a result of the revolution, or a reflection of a temperament forged in the blast furnace of the island's unique history, or more likely an admixture of the two, braided together by serendipity and fate? I was also drawn to the unprecedented cultural outpouring, especially in the visual arts and in the cinema, that the revolution unleashed. That creative explosion also engendered a backlash of censorious apparatchiks. Most of them, it pains me to say, were opportunistic hacks from the pre-Castro Communist Party, notorious for its timidity and its devotion to dogma, looking to ride to power on the backs of the victorious Barbudos of the 26th of July movement, who were determined to rein in the more anarchic spirits of Cuban intellectual life, leading to the suffocations of the so-called gray years of the early to mid-1970s. It's a depressing tale, one that starts with the suppression of Lunes de Revolución, the feisty, eclectic literary weekly, and concludes with the ascendancy of Verde Olivio, the chief journal of the armed forces, as arbiter of the country's cultural policies. Whatever the wafflings and uncertainties and aesthetic and political ambiguities and contradictions of the early over-oxygenated 1960s, there occurred by the late 1960s what might reasonably be called an internal putsch with respect to the revolution's cultural policies. Even so informed and close an observer as Rebecca Gordon Nesbitt, who's written probably the definitive book that traces the trajectory of these policies as they waxed and waned, concluded in her important book published only a couple of years ago that by the end of that remarkable decade, the Cuban, and I quote, the Cuban armed forces exerted visible and sustained control over the cultural life of the country. In this way, the connection between the cultural leadership and the artistic vanguard was severed with disastrous results. The Cuban historian and curator Geraldo Mosquera agreed, rendering an unsparing verdict that, quote, the basic result for culture was the closure of the plural, intense, and quite autonomous scene that had prevailed. No official style was dictated, but a practice of culture as ideological propaganda was imposed along with a stereotyped nationalism. Journals were closed, editors fired, professors lost their jobs, were banished to factories far from Havana, prominent cultural figures left the country, cultural life stagnated, boldness was out, timidity was in, the price of survival was keeping your head down. A surpassing irony, however, was obvious and little remarked upon. Despite all the effort expended on denouncing the neo-colonial imposition of cultural forms from elsewhere, and here our mutual friend and comrade Roberto Fernandez Retamar was crucial in a imperishable essay on Caliban that made his reputation. Despite all the efforts to secure and promote nativist and folkloric cultural expressions as somehow more authentic and representative of Cuba's indigenous culture. And by indigenous, I don't mean the original Indians, the Taínos, who were found to live on the island for 10,000 previous years prior to the arrival of the Spanish, who in their zeal to convert them to Christianity exterminated every last one of them. And the only trace really that remains is in the language. Any number of Cuban terms and cities bear names that are rooted in the Taínos language, as Guantanamo, for instance, and some others. By indigenous, we mean the influence of African and Spanish forms largely. The revolution seemed never to have any misgivings about embracing Alicia Alonso's classical ballet, derived from an aristocratic French tradition. Nor was the revolution ever troubled by Cubans' love for baseball, with its American origins. Of course, the whole notion of culture and what it is for and who gets to make it and how it affects people is always fraught and complicated. Allow me to end these overlong reflections, for which I thank you your patience, with 3 stories. 30 years ago, in 1989, I spent a considerable amount of time in the company of Jose Pepe Rodriguez Feo. 4 years later, he would die, age 73. As a young man, he was the founder of the literary quarterly Origins. He invited me over to his apartment in Vedado, not far from the Havana Libre. Across the hall in his building had lived his good friend, the poet Virgilio Piñera. Pepe was the scion of a wealthy sugar baron. He had attended Harvard in the 1940s. He had befriended the poet Wallace Stevens, with whom he carried on a 10-year correspondence, which correspondence, by the way, was published in 1986 in a volume by Duke University Press called Secretaries of the Moon. In 1959, Pepe was the only one of his family to cast his lot with the revolution. He refused to flee the country. Instead, he renounced his inheritance, enrolled himself in the service of the new dispensation. He was among those born before the revolution who came to be regarded after 1959 as one of the men in transition, not likely to become a new man, the ideal Che did so much to encourage. His fate and the men and women in that particular class that he represented were the subject of a fantastic early Cuban film by Tomas Gutierrez Alea called Memories of Underdevelopment, which is based on a novel of the same name by Edmundo Desnoyes.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
We We
That's
finish.
okay, let him
We
finish.
finish at
I'm almost
12:30,
He's on the
Yeah,
list.
and we need some questions.
Yes.
We will,
It's okay.
we'll have questions.
Not to worry.
But
Yeah.
revolutions never can respect full deadlines, otherwise they don't get made.
Exactly. Memories of underdevelopment?
Yes, memories of underdevelopment. We're about done, and we'll have time for questions. We met in his apartment for a modest dinner, which he'd gone to considerable lengths to prepare. What I mostly remember is drinking rum steadily with him until about 3 a.m., when I finally took my leave and stumbled back to my hotel. He asked how I had spent my day. I'd been wandering around the city, and just before coming over to him, I'd spent a couple hours in the bookstore catty corner across from the Havana Libre. He doubted whether I'd found anything of interest aside from the dusty volumes of the selected writings of Enver Hoxha, the leader of communist Albania. I said, on the contrary, I had. I had found in a corner Eric Auerbach's imperishable Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, written by a great German Jewish scholar who had fled Nazi Germany, holed up in Constantinople without benefit of his library, and wrote from memory one of the great works of literary interpretation, a book that remains in print, published by the Bulletin Press, the Bulletin imprint of Princeton University Press, and today is reprinted with a foreword by Edward Said. Very important book. It's called Mimesis, Mimesis, subtitled The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. It's sort of from Homer to James Joyce.
What's his name?
Eric Auerbach, Auerbach. He was astonished. He said, "It's good news and bad news. The good news was that such a book could be found in today's Cuba, and that thanks to the revolution, the country was 100% literate. The bad news was that you'd be hard-pressed," he said, "to find a single person born after the revolution who could understand even a tenth of the book's references or its argument." Story number 2. 9 years ago, in 2010, through the magic of the internet, I met up with Wilfredo Marshall, my old cane-cutting partner in the great and forlorn 10 million ton Zafra of 1970, which nearly wrecked the Cuban economy. I hadn't seen him in 4 decades. Despite all my trips to Cuba, for some reason I had never bothered to look him up. But 40 years after we first met, we met again. Black as anthracite, the son of a longshoreman, he'd come from a dirt-poor family of 12 brothers and sisters. When I met him, he was a 22-year-old agronomy student at the University of Havana. I was a newly minted Berkeley High kid of 17, hell-bent on making history. Wilfredo went on to found the University of Camagüey and became dean of its School of Agronomy. All his brothers and sisters became doctors and lawyers, professional people. They all still live in Cuba. We drank rum. We were up till 3 in the morning. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Steve, I know all the problems of this revolution. I have lived through every one of them. But I want to tell you something. There's one thing my family knew from the start. We didn't need Castro or Marx to tell us we needed a revolution and that it would be a good thing for me and my family." And finally, story number 3. Pablo Armando Fernandez, the chief reason for my trip to Cuba last month. He is now 90, and I had been told he was bedridden and dying. I needed to say goodbye. One of the original editors of the literary supplement Lunes, which enjoyed a brief 18-month run as the freewheeling section devoted to arts and cultural commentary to the newspaper Revolution. He published Allen Ginsberg. He published Jean-Paul Sartre. Even a figure like Bob Silvers, the founding editor, several years later in 1963 during the New York newspaper strike, the founding editor of the New York Review of Books, turned to Lunes as inspiration. Silvers having made an inspiring trip to Cuba in 1960 and having met with Pablo Armando. Pablo is a survivor. He was among that band of mischief makers that included such brash writers and poets as Alberto Padilla, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Carlos Franchi, that put out a publication that became a target of a bruising battle. It was a battle he lost. A notorious meeting was held in the National Library in the very early 60s where Fidel, whose moral authority as head of the victorious rebel army was unchallenged, Fidel castigated the assembled eggheads and scribblers and issued a striking and chilling pronunciamento, even a commandment. Fidel declared, Within the revolution, everything. Without the revolution, nothing. Lunes closed. It was
Is that Lunas? I'm sorry.
Lunes, as in Mondays.
Lunes.
Lunes,
Oh,
It was published
on
as a
Mondays.
supplement of Revolucion newspaper, and it was published on a Monday, so it was called Lunes de Revolucion.
Right,
And it lasted 18 months,
yeah.
something like that.
The unruly bohemianism of the Barbudos was soon gone. A Stalinist starch was ironed into the Criollo insouciance. The radiant future became luminous with casualties. Cabrera Infante, appointed cultural attaché in Belgium, would defect to England in 1965. Padilla, despite winning a prestigious Casa de las Americas prize for his poetry, would be forced in the early 1970s to publicly confess his thought crimes in a scandal that recalled the ugly years of Stalin's show trials. Ultimately, Padilla, a man I knew, would leave the island for the